our discussion today with Emily Qureshi-Hurst and a discussion of her prize-winning book, Salvation in the Block Universe, Time, Tillich and Transformation, which was published in 2024 by Cambridge, indeed, Cambridge University Press. And Emily is one of the sort of leading lights in the younger generation, I think I'm allowed to say, of people working at the interface of theology and the sciences, having spent some time in Oxford, where I think most of the research for this work took place. Emily's now crossed, shall we say, over to Cambridge and is currently working affiliated to the Faculty of Divinity and possibly philosophy. I'm not sure. And it's a really great pleasure to be able to speak to Emily and to pull out some of the issues and substantive questions around this book. I suppose I'm going to begin really with a sort of classic. This is not an interview. This is a conversation, but the sort of classic interview opener, really, which is to really ask kind of how. So you've moved from Oxford to Cambridge, and you've been active in this area of science and religion for a while. It'd be really interesting to have a sense of where you feel those conversations are going and the difference that you sense between Oxford and Cambridge, and how your own work is developing in that context.
Thank you. Yeah. So first, I'd like to just thank the ISSR for awarding me the book prize for Salvation in the Block Universe. It's a huge honor, and I'm really, really grateful. To answer the question, one of the main differences, actually, and it's not a difference between Oxford and Cambridge as such, is a difference between what I'm spending most of my time doing, is at Oxford, I was primarily employed to do research, which culminated in the publication of this book. And at Cambridge, I'm only employed to teach, really. So I have been doing some research, but it's been far less of a percentage of my time. And that's been a real shift because I've spent most of my career up until this point doing research most of the time. So now I'm teaching theology and natural science to undergraduates. And that's been really, really enjoyable because I've been able to have the ideas that I've been developing challenged in new ways by undergraduates, such bright, engaged, thoughtful undergraduates. And so one of the things that I've learned from being at Cambridge is, or I've been developing my ability to, I guess, translate the more technical philosophical work I've done in my PhD and in this monograph into more accessible language. And that's led actually to the publication of a book that's just come out about a month ago called Decoding the Cosmos, it contains some of the same ideas as there are in Salvation in the Block Universe, but aimed at an undergraduate audience. So I guess I've been trying to develop different registers of explaining these ideas. So yeah, technical monographs and then kind of more accessible stuff as well.
So thanks. That's great. Just maybe helpful just to have a sense really of where you're coming at this from. So in a sense, your own background, if you're coming at this primarily from a scientific or theological, or just one of those people who just thinks these are really good questions and we need to think about them.
So I was trained as a philosopher and theologian at Oxford. I did the joint honours in philosophy and theology as an undergraduate. And then I left. I worked in recruitment and went traveling. And then I decided to come back to academia because working in recruitment, I didn't like it. It wasn't for me. So, and there I went back to Oxford and I studied the MST in science and religion. So my foundation was in philosophy and theology, but then quite quickly I started graduate work bringing science in as well. So I'm not a trained scientist, but I have been engaging with scientific ideas for a long time. I then did the PhD in science and religion as well, and my PhD thesis formed the foundation for the book Salvation in the Block Universe. My personal perspective is I'm not religious, which makes me unusual in the science and religion field. It was very common as an undergraduate to be interested in philosophy and theology, but to not be religious yourself, to identify as an atheist or an agnostic. But each level you ascend through the academic pipeline, the atheists and the agnostics tend to fall away. And if they stay, they tend to be interested in trying to disprove religion from the perspective of science. The kind of thing that was very popular in the new atheist movement. But that's not the perspective that I come from. So I find these questions so fascinating. Questions about the nature of ultimate reality, the nature of time, change, identity, all of these philosophical, theological, and scientific questions, I think, are super important. And religion, science, and philosophy all come at them from different directions. And I think you get the richest and most interesting answers to those questions when you bring the disciplines into dialogue with one another. So even though I don't subscribe to the truth claims made by religion, I think that the religious and theological perspective on these issues is really, really valuable. So yeah, I guess that's a bit about my personal background and my personal belief system that I'm kind of operating within.
Yeah, no, that's so a couple of really interesting sense there of that of the constitution, as it were, of the discipline and how uh, those who are perhaps have who are taking well who don't bring a personal belief sort of, as it were, fall off as you go up the along the development. That's interesting. As a fellow, I should say, I also took philosophy and theology at Oxford as an undergraduate. And I remember an interview being asked, why would you want to combine these two? And I said, well, why wouldn't you? It's just obvious, really. These are the two disciplines that ask big questions and have kind of pedigree in some interesting, if not necessarily satisfactory, answers. So that's really interesting. I mean, so let's you pick some really big topics: philosophy of time and salvation. So you're really kind of going to the heart of things here. If we can just follow the structure of your book to some extent and think initially about the understanding of time that you set out in this book. So I remember being asked to give a lecture at some point on philosophy of time and its relevance to theology, and mugging up on McTaggart and A series and B series, and just thinking, my goodness, this is crazy stuff, amazing, but just mind blowing. You present and defend an account of the block universe, and so my my unfair question is: could you give a simplified or at least accessible account of what you mean by that, and what you understand that philosophy of time to be saying, really? What's important about it?
Yeah, that's a really important question because the block universe forms the metaphysical context in which all of the discussions about theology take place. So I think it's probably helpful to start by defining or setting out its opposing theory or opposing set of theories, and then talking about the block universe. I think that's probably going to be helpful for people who are unfamiliar with the philosophy of time. So I guess our intuitive understanding of time, if you ask most people, is that time really passes, that there's an objective present moment that we call now, and that there are potential future events that are not yet real, that then come into existence when they become simultaneous with this objective now, and then fade off into the distant past. So that view is called presentism. and it claims that the only things that exist are presently existing things, and things come into and go out of existence in accordance with their presentness. The block universe is a denial of this. It's essentially its metaphysical opposite. So the block universe claims that all points of time exist, like all points of space exist, in a four-dimensional block of space-time. So it's really inspired by and founded upon Einstein's relativity theories that unite time and space into a more fundamental space-time. And I guess it's helpful to think about it by pushing this analogy between time and space a bit further. So I wouldn't claim that New Delhi doesn't exist because I'm not there perceiving it. But we think it's perfectly natural to claim that 2050 doesn't exist and 2001 doesn't exist because I'm not there perceiving them. And the block universe just says this is the wrong way to think about time. Even though we seem to experience time as though it flows or passes, in fact, it doesn't. And any perceived dynamism in our temporal experience is a consequence of our own perception rather than something out there in the world. So moments of time exist in the block always and forever. And if there is any motion at all, it's the motion of us, our conscious experience moving through the block. So the dinosaurs are just as real as I am, and I'm just as real as the human colonization of exoplanets, if that's something that is going to happen in our future. So I guess just another analogy that might be helpful if people are still struggling to visualize that is A series or presentist time flows like a river, and block universe or B theoretic time is a bit like an iceberg. So all of the temporal relations are fixed. There are objective facts about which events are between which other events, but there is no dynamic moving time. There's no objective present moment. Instead, all moments of time exist in this metaphysical four-dimensional block.
I won't say that that's totally clear, in as much as thinking about the nature of time. If you think it's clear, you've probably not quite got it. But thank you for that. And just to reiterate, so those that you talk about A series and B series, that goes back to McTaggart's classification.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
One of those amazing publications that still sets the agenda for the field, really. Yeah. Can I ask you, thank you for setting that out so clearly. I suppose my question is, this might sound very theoretical and very much in those sort of higher echelons of philosophizing. What does the empirical? Do we have empirical data? Is there any way of sort of settling this sort of question empirically? I mean, where are you with that?
So I think the best evidence in favor of the block universe or against presentism in the A theory comes from Einstein's relativity theories. And the claim within these theories that there is no empirical way to substantiate an absolute relation of simultaneity that holds outside of your observational perspective. So we could get into some quite technical arguments. I'm conscious that we probably don't want to do that. So in special relativity, Einstein demonstrated that your measurements of both spatial distance and temporal duration will be dependent on your observational perspective. And if you're traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, very, very, very fast, then time will pass differently for you than it will for somebody who is remaining relatively stationary on the surface of the Earth. And what this tells us, this idea that there is no absolute simultaneity, is that, well, in my view, it problematizes this requirement of the A theory of time that there is one objective universal now. And that's really important because this objective now is the knife edge that separates the future from the past. And so if you don't have an absolute simultaneity relation, if there is no absolute now, then it becomes very difficult to say future events are not real and then become real when they are present and then go out of existence, because there is no objective now. And the same is the case in general relativity. So people might remember the scene from Interstellar where there's some astronauts on a spaceship, and two of them, I think, go onto a massive planet, and one of them stays on the spaceship. And for the people who have gone to this massive planet, it feels like about an hour has passed. But then they return to the spaceship, and their colleague who was left there, it's been at least a decade, I can't remember exactly how long. And this is time dilation that occurs as a result of being in proximity to a gravitational field. And again, there's technical reasons why that's the case, which we don't need to go into. But both theories of relativity problematize this idea that you can have an absolute now and that time passes at the same rate everywhere in the universe and for all people. So if an A theory requires that, it seems that there's good empirical evidence to reject that. And there are alternative explanations that try and make sense of absolute flowing time in the context of relativity. In my view, they're not particularly successful, and they've had a mixed reception in the field. So I think it is a minority position to take an A theory of time when we're looking at special and general relativity. And to me, it makes more sense to say that they support a block universe, because the block universe doesn't require absolute time. It doesn't require temporal passage. It doesn't require a non-real future, a real present, and a non-real past. And so I think the best empirical evidence comes from relativity.
Yeah, thanks. I'm aware that obviously there will be some who might want to challenge the empirical groundings of such arguments, but let's leave those technical arguments set them aside for the moment. I mean, just one final question on that, really, which is so some might hear this and might be thinking that this is not just applying kind of theories of relativity to time, but this is relative in a stronger sense, and this is a sort of pushing towards the idea that time is just an illusion. There's no reality whatsoever. There's no change. There's no time is just sort of simply, as it were, purely subjective. I don't understand that's what you're wanting to say. Is that right?
No, so this was McTaggart's argument. He made a two-stage argument. One, that time had to be described by the A series, so presentism, that kind of thing that I've been talking about, and two, that generated a contradiction, and so time itself was unreal. And people who propose and endorse the block universe don't want to say that time is unreal. They want to say temporal passage and temporal duration is unreal. So time becomes the fourth dimension of the space-time, of the fabric of space-time. It still exists. It's just not, it's temporal duration. No, sorry, not duration. It's temporal dynamism and temporal passage that are unreal and that are purely subjectively generated from a block universe view.
And this will get us, as you can see where I'm going with this, will get us onto the theology here. So that's to say that change is a meaningful notion in the context of the block universe. Perhaps not how we would think about it in an A series understanding, but nonetheless, some sort of notion of change is coherent.
So scholars disagree about this. I think the general consensus, well, if there is a consensus, there's not really. The general view of lots of them is that you can have change in the block universe, but it looks different, as you said, to what change looks like if you have an A series or a presentist understanding of time. So we typically think of change as being deeply connected to time. So I might have the example, I give quite a mundane example in the opening pages of my book about dyeing my hair. And I say, imagine, this is how we typically understand change. So imagine I have blonde hair on a Monday, and then on Tuesday, I decide to dye it brown. As the time changes or the date changes from Monday to Tuesday, that substantiates the change in my hair color. So I an event takes place, I dye my hair, it was blonde, it's now brown, I have undergone a change in hair color. But the problem on the block universe is that Monday and Tuesday are equally real. So I have both blonde hair and brown hair. We might think of this as me having multiple temporal parts. I have a 4-dimensional temporal extension, and the temporal part that exists on Monday has blonde hair. The temporal part that exists on Tuesday has brown hair. But there's no objective way to say I've changed from one to the other because I'm both, just at different points in my own timeline. And so in the book, what I try and do is set out this problem as it relates to the doctrine of salvation, particularly personal salvation. So the kind of salvation, sorry, that requires a transformation in time from being fallen to being saved, and that this should be an objective change. That's problematized, I think, by the block universe. And so I'm trying to unpack this problem and see whether there are different ways we can understand change as more subjective and qualitative and phenomenologically generated, and in that way recover a notion of salvation within the block universe that doesn't require an objective change in time.
Yeah, that's helpful. And that anticipates, of course, the argument that you set out in detail in the book. And to do that, you don't just, as it were, you do have some very, I suppose, direct, kind of constructive theological proposals that you make, particularly at the final chapter. But you don't do this alone. You draw on a particular theological resource, namely the understanding of Paul Tillich. So Tillich, German Lutheran, 1886 to 1965, emigrated to America just before the Second World War, and famously the theologian of correlation, famously in some ways a difficult, abstract thinker, someone whose perhaps star, we might say, has waned somewhat recently. And I should, for full disclosure, say someone on whom I've written and have a particular interest. Apart from just the fascinating complexities of Tillich's own thought, why Tillich?
So there's a couple of different reasons. I first encountered Tillich as an undergraduate, and I just was captivated by his work. I really found him.
It wasn't Trevor Williams who taught you, by any chance?
No, it wasn't. No.
Okay. It was a chap, dean at Trinity, and did the special theologian paper.
No, it was the God, Christ, and Salvation paper that I encountered him in. So it was a few different 20th century theologians, and Tillich really stood out for me as somebody who, I think partly the appeal was the fact that I'm an atheist, and Tillich wasn't. He took a more abstract and philosophical approach to these theological questions that was very much rooted in Christian theology, but was, to me, refreshing and slightly different. He took an unorthodox approach to these things, to these issues, which I found very engaging. So I always liked him. And when I was coming to write the PhD and think about which theological interlocutor I wanted to choose, one of the appeals of Tillich was his method of correlation. And this is a method that I follow in the book. So Tillich had this deep commitment to theology being an outward-facing, communicative, dynamic discipline that's not just stuck in the past, that's not just rooted in analysis of one particular text, the Bible, but instead is continuously engaging in conversations with all areas of human culture. So not just science, although science is the aspect of human culture that I use in the book, but politics and history and art as well. And he thought that theology was enriched by having these conversations with other areas of human thought and human life, and it also could serve a communicative and an apologetic function in that you translate these ancient traditional symbols, theological symbols, into the cultural language of the day in which that theology is to be received. So the method of correlation works by first posing a philosophical or cultural question. So you look at culture and you see what are the prevailing questions, what are the prevailing issues or disciplinary frameworks. You identify some key questions and then you develop a theological answer in response to those prevailing cultural questions. And so for Tillich, his methodology, or his how he applied this methodology, was to construct a very existentialist informed theological system. So existentialism was hugely popular when he was writing, and he saw the prevailing cultural questions as being existentialist in nature. And I think that might be one of the reasons why Tillich has waned a little bit in recent years, is that he was writing very specifically for a particular cultural moment and was hugely popular and influential in that cultural moment. And then as culture has moved on, Tillich's work has faded a little out of popular discourse. But that's not a flaw. That's a feature of the design of of his theological system. That's part of the method of correlation. And he has this metaphor where he says a theological system is but a station on the never ending journey towards deeper understanding. So we stop at a particular station. That's his theological system, but we are to move forward and push things in a new direction. And so I think Tillich's method of correlation was very, very appealing to me. So pose a philosophical question, give a theological answer. And those are the two parts of my book. So part one is the philosophical question about the block universe and the nature of change. Part two is the theological answer. And I also thought that Tillich's work was particularly suitable for the kind of argument that I wanted to make about salvation being, or a salvific change, a salvific transformation, being psychological, subjective, phenomenological. And so I guess in terms of both its method and its content, the work of Tillich felt to me to be the perfect theological material to get into.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. With that, I think I was trying to remember exactly, but I think it was a comment that Tillich made to Langdon Gilkey about what he described as a planned obsolescence. That he didn't. It's almost a marker of success that there are no faithful Tillichians taking forward exactly what he said and representing it. The idea is that you take up the sort of Tillichian approach and then reapply it differently in different situations. I suppose think about methodology for a moment. You think about that notion of correlation, and you refer to, of course, to David Tracy and that sort of refinement of the method of correlation, which can be kind of somewhat clunkily presented as the culture poses a question and the theology, religious tradition provides an answer. And of course, there's a worry there that either this is prioritizing the question, and the question then sort of determines the form of the answer, and so the answer is given to the determines the question, or vice versa, that this is a question posed in sort of good faith, which then gets sort of flattened, as it were, by the imposition of an answer. So I mean, my sense is that you're wanting to see Tillich as a sort of exemplar of a methodology that tries to hold question and answer in tension and creatively work in that sort of space. Is that right?
Yeah, I think what Tillich's method gives for me is an encouragement to have a continuous, nuanced dialogue between theology and theological tradition and contemporary culture, including things like philosophy and science. So it's not just here's the question, here's the answer. Instead, it's a dynamic interplay between those two things. And I think that it's a particularly useful approach to have in mind when we're doing science and religion, because these two disciplines are so radically different in the way that they approach the world and the way that they generate their own answers and their own data, the corpus, their body. So having this continuous ongoing conversation is the best way to enrich them both. So yeah, it's not as simple as here's the question, here's the answer, conversation over. Instead, it's an invitation to have an open and ongoing dialogue between these two poles.
This is perhaps unfair, but if I can sort of really push you on that, in the sense of the reciprocal exchange. We'll get on to how the theology engages with the questions of change and worries of change without change that the block universe raises. But just before that, I mean, how much do you think this works the other way? How much can you see the theological understanding impacting upon the philosophical, scientific understanding of the nature of time?
It depends on the person it depends on your personal perspective. So in terms of generally, science doesn't listen to theology very much at all. Philosophy a little bit more so. But for somebody who is, say, a scientist or a philosopher, but is also religious, then yeah, I think there's going to be more of a back and forth. So William Lane Craig is a good example of this. He's a philosopher of time and a philosopher of religion, but he's also a profoundly committed Christian. And the theistic context in which he lives is the foundation for everything else. So he's interpreting relativity through the lens of his understanding of the nature of God and the kind of world that God would create. So there, and again, it's not as simplistic as saying this is what I think God would be like, and so I'm going to develop this particular understanding of science and philosophy. It's not, that would be very reductive, and that's not the kind of thing that Craig is doing. But it's about, I guess, what your starting point is, or what your prior beliefs are, your epistemic foundation. And if your epistemic foundation is theism, then that theistic context is going to shape how you interpret philosophy and science as well. But in general, broad and general terms, you don't hear scientists listening to theologians very much, unfortunately. No.
Yeah, no, no. I suppose one specific, in this context, one specific kind of issue there might be, I suppose, thinking about eternity, understandings of eternity, that theological understandings of eternity may be said in some ways to be to have the potential to inform non-theological, scientific, philosophical understanding of eternity. But I guess that's a separate question. So thinking back to your project and the dilemma that you raised earlier about change from your help, and to restate that in kind of Christian doctrinal terms, in terms of a change from fallen to say, however that's understood, status. That seems to be like something that's a real change. So there's soteriology, Christian doctrine, and salvation seem to be dependent upon some sense of a real and meaningful change from fallen to saved, or however. And that does seem to take place in time. That does seem to be a change that occurs either within lives or within more than terrestrial lives, depending how you think about it, but nonetheless on some sort of temporal plane, as it were. So you spelled out very clearly how the sort of block universe understanding that you endorse would challenge any sense of of there being a temporal shift, as it were, or an alteration across time. So how, short version of the question, how does Tillich help you answer that question?
So I guess there's two related problems that the block universe raises for salvation. One of them is this problem of objective change. So the idea that you go from objectively being fallen to then objectively being saved, and that's a clear transformation that's happened in time. The other one is the problem of persisting sin, and this is something that theologians like Andrew Hollingsworth and Ryan Mullins have talked about. And that's the idea that in the block universe, if you have undergone a transformation to, like in scripture, I can't remember exactly which verse, it says, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. And there's something about the past sinful state that is eliminated or gone, and somebody is now existing in a new state of being saved. So there's the problem of persisting sin and the problem of personal transformation. In the block universe, your fallen previous temporal parts are not gone. So you haven't objectively changed from one to the other, and that sin hasn't been annihilated. The problem I focus on is very much the problem of personal transformation, and the problem of persisting sin persists. That's still a problem that's not necessarily solved. And that's not such a problem for me, because I think maybe that's, on a Christian worldview, maybe sin isn't really eliminated until the eschaton anyway. So for me, that's not as much of a problem as it is for some other theologians. But for the problem of personal transformation, I think Tillich is particularly helpful because of the way that he understands fallenness. And he takes, as I've already said, a very existentialist approach to his theology. So he sees fallenness as being characterized by old being, and salvation as being characterized by new being. And old being is existing in a state of deep and profound anxiety, alienation from the ground of being, which is God, and also the fullest realization of your own potential. So something about coming into existence means the collapsing of this huge amount of potential, all of the potentialities in a human life, and potentiality in terms of what's possible for humans in general, then is collapsed into one finite existence. And in doing so, in coming into existence, we feel this collapse of our potential into a single actuality. And we feel this separation we've experienced from the ground of being. And that creates a profound fear of meaninglessness. We're aware of our infinitude. We fear falling back into non-being. And all of these ways of understanding fallenness are extremely experiential. It's about how we feel as much as it is about the ontological state that we're in, and the relational state that we're in as well. So there's ontology, relationality, particularly with God, and experience. And his understanding of salvation is about, not entirely, but is partly about psychological healing and an overcoming of this sense of alienation, this angst, this estrangement from the ground of being, because of what happens relationally. So you become united, or you enter into a deeper relationship with God. And that brings about a psychological healing. And so the ontological transformation from old being to new being is, for Tillich, on my interpretation, less important, or not the only important thing. We really ought to understand salvation as well as being about this transformation from fear of meaningless, estrangement, alienation, to reconciliation and healing and a profound relationality with God. And that lends itself very well to the kind of change that I want to develop, the idea of change I want to develop in the book, which is a subjective change. So it's a change in our psychological state as much as it is in our fundamental ontology. And that's perfectly compatible with the block universe, because we do have subjective changes in our mental states. And so it's a bit more technical than that in the book, but that's the broad idea.
Yeah. So in a way to pass this in perhaps more sort of psychological terms, is this akin to the idea of saying that, for, say, think of a dynamic of forgiveness, that one one moves from a sort of state of resentment towards forgiveness. That doesn't mean to say that those previous thoughts go away. It's that they are transformed in some sense, retained. There's that. So there's not a sort of object. There's not a kind of all or nothing kind of movement from one state to another. Is that a sort of a parallel,
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a helpful way to think about it. Yeah. Apologies about my lighting situation. It's getting dark and I just have a lamp on my desk. So
okay.
Sorry if I'm a bit ghostly.
That's fine, that's fine. We're going to run out of time in very soon, but I wanted to pick up on a couple of points. One, I just want to say, I think that way that you're engaging with Tillich is really, really helpful, really, really interesting. And I mean, often Tillich is sort of described as the theologian who puts everything into ontological categories. He talks about being, ground of being, all being. But I think you're absolutely right, to say that in a way what he's wanting to do is he's wanting to draw attention to the ontological significance of the psychological. So that it's not sort of either or. It's that and it relates to his understanding, of course, of Jesus, Christ as the bearer of the new being, all that kind of those slightly sort of dark at times controversies about whether his understanding of the resurrection, whether he's really resurrected, what that might mean, and it's to do with the sense. I think that would be a good example of that sense of change, perhaps, that for the early first disciples, obviously objectively, there's no Jesus is dead, but is alive to them, and that's a meaningful thing to say. It's has an ontological significance. That's not as it were purely subjective. So that's very interesting. Kind of getting into some of the really interesting things about it. So actually, two more questions, if I may, and then we're going to probably have to wrap up. One, I suppose I'm interested thinking more, and this might not be the sort of thing you're engaging with, but thinking more in a kind of intellectual history kind of context, and thinking about how some of these ideas, you mentioned Einstein, sort of visionary ideas about understandings of time in the early 20th century, and Tillich developing his theological innovations in that period. I mean, do you sort of see this as being kind of part of the same, a sort of common kind of cultural zeitgeist or such? Or I mean, are there kind of intellectual history connections here that might be interesting in terms of these understandings of time and understandings of change, and being philosophically, theologically, scientifically, artistically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've been thinking about time as far back as we have records. So it's one of these really deeply persistent questions. And I think it makes sense, right? Because we are fundamentally temporal creatures. We live very much within the bounds of time. We have a temporally structured existence. It informs every aspect of our lives, from arranging when to meet somebody to dreading or being really excited about future events, to being nostalgic about the past. So it makes perfect sense to me that we've always been thinking about time, and in some ways, we've been thinking about time in new ways as a result of Einstein's relativity theories and quantum mechanics as well, and scientific developments. But in another sense, the most profound questions we've been asking about time go all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. And so there is this deep need within us to think about temporal questions. And I think you can very much chart the intellectual history of reflections on time. And there are, as I said, there are differences in the empirical stuff we might bring into the conversation and the philosophical categories we're using. But in terms of those fundamental questions, actually, they've been remarkably consistent since the beginning. What is time? Does time pass? Is there an objective difference between the past and the future? These kind of questions have been occupying humans forever, and I'm sure will continue to do so.
Yeah. No, I mean, I suppose I was thinking of that sort of moment of sort of intellectual ferment around the First World War, after the First World War, and I was thinking, Tillich obviously was very engaged with the expressionist movement, culturally, artistically, which not unrelated to sort of sort of Picasso type fracturing of time, taking the moment apart and sort of representing it, and but really playing, and of course the other aspect of a sense of the kind of acceleration of time in the course of the 20th century. So I think these time is not, I suppose, yes, I would say absolutely these are perennial questions, but they sort of take on a particular force, a particular urgency, maybe, in that period that Tillich is, and the philosophers of science that philosopher of time that you're engaging with, are thinking. And on that, really, as my last question, substantive one, is about a particular understanding of time that is quite important for Tillich and others, which you refer to in the book, the idea of kairos. This idea that there's a sort of qualitative sense of time, that there's the sense of a sort of richness, or fullness, depth of time, and that's not unrelated to ideas of salvation. So rather than perhaps thinking in terms primarily of salvation as a chronological shift, as we might think about your hair from Monday to Tuesday, on the assumption you dye your hair every night. This is more of a qualitative shift, to something that you might never kind of capture adequately in chronological terms. And so therefore the sort of change talking about understanding the time relevant to discussion of salvation might need to be kind of further nuanced in that sense. So I mean, I suppose, is there anything that you'd want to say further to that, really?
I think you put it really well. There is this idea of kairos present in Tillich it's deeply experiential. So in terms of the kind of subjective understanding of salvation I'm trying to develop, kairos fits perfectly into that. Yeah, I don't have much more to say other than what you've said, but I think I completely agree. Kairos is really, really important here.
I mean, just to add that, I'd say one interesting thing, of course, is that Tillich talks about sort of the great kairos, to which he is committed, and you're standing within the theological circle of Christianity, but he doesn't exclude other kairoi, and so that raises interesting questions about other forms of salvation, or other forms of transformation that might not be best expressed in terms of salvation, wishing to avoid a kind of Hickeyan imposition of a particular understanding of change. So yeah, that's really interesting. I think, and I'm desperately trying not to make time jokes, but as unfortunately we are running out of time. I suppose I asked you right at the beginning, how this book fits into your own work and your kind of the genesis of this. You've indicated the sense of what you're up to now. I suppose my final question is what next? Where might your research in this area or others be leading? And when can we give you another prize?
Yeah, so I feel like I've said most of what I want to say about time now. I worked on it for a long period of time. So from my master's through to my PhD, my my junior research fellowship at Oxford, and I'm ready to close that chapter, at least for now. So I'm moving on. I'm working at the moment on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and I've been working on that in a part-time sense for a while because I've been teaching and finishing this book and my other book and all sorts. But next year, I'm starting on a project that I've been developing with some colleagues for a couple of years now, and it's on quantum mechanics and theology. And there I'll be full-time working on, I'll be writing a book on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics and its implications for philosophy and theology. So questions of time may well come up there, but time isn't going to be my primary focus moving forward. I'm interested, I guess, in similar questions about salvation and identity and morality, but just looking at a different scientific context.
Brilliant. Well, look forward to the outputs of that work. For now, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and to learn more about your work and delve into this fascinating book. And it really is. I think I would say an exemplary work in two respects, and one in terms of the sort of science and religion engagement, one that doesn't prioritize either pole, as it were, either partner really, but takes the science and philosophy of science and empirical work seriously and engages with the theological questions and takes those seriously, and throws them into the mix and sort of sees what comes out. But also, I think a really interesting engagement with Tillich and with the potential for Tillich to be an interesting discussion partner in conversations that he may or may not have imagined. That's the sort of mark of interesting theological work, isn't it? That sort of takes things out of their context and works with them. So thank you very much again, I think we probably need to finish off there.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you, and thank you so much again to the ISSR for the prize. Yeah, it's just wonderful. So thank you so much.